Okay, so it's happened. I have just been diagnosed with ADHD to go along with my autism. So what does it mean to have both? To break this down, what I thought might be helpful is to do a two-part series with part one just explaining what ADHD is and part two what it looks like to have both autism and ADHD. So let's go. Hi, I'm Phil, a very late diagnosed autistic ADHD adult, and it's my goal to advocate for other neurodivergent adults by sharing positive information and personal experiences. So in this first part, I want to break down exactly what ADHD is and how it affects me. And then next time, we will go a bit deeper and look at how ADHD and autism combine to be more than the sum of the parts. So first up, what is ADHD? ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, also referred to as ADD or Attention Deficit Disorder, affects the brain's high-level thinking and can affect attention and the ability to self-regulate behaviour, thoughts and emotions. Current scientific evidence suggests ADHD, like autism, is a developmental condition, which means you are born with it. Also, like autism, it may be that ADHD traits become evident over time through childhood. Studies show that ADHD is highly heritable, about 70%, but may also occur as a result of factors such as low birth weight, premature birth, or factors during pregnancy, including smoking or drinking. ADHD is broken down into three subtypes: inattentive ADHD, hyperactive impulsive ADHD, and the combined type, which mashes both together. While ADHD is often referred to as having an attention deficit, it could also be thought about as having hyperattention. This can mean that the ADHD person is constantly experiencing stimuli from all sources at once, which might make it difficult to focus on any one thing. So what are the common symptoms of ADHD? Firstly, the inattentive symptoms may include things like losing things like keys or wallet, etc. Difficulty remembering things. Starting but not finishing tasks. Procrastination, or putting off tasks that require mental effort, may be then followed by last-minute rush. Not following instructions. Lack of attention to detail. Making careless mistakes. Trouble concentrating on boring or tedious tasks. Trouble listening. Disorganisation. Mess. And forgetfulness. Hyperactivity and impulsive symptoms may include interrupting other people or intruding without thinking, finishing off other people's sentences or blurting out answers, excessive talking, difficulty waiting in lines, fidgeting or squirming, restlessness, being always on the go, trouble staying seated, reacting quickly to situations without assessing the consequences, looking for stimulation, taking risks or engaging in extreme sports, impulsive shopping or overeating, craving salty foods, excessive use of social media or video games, being a spender rather than a saver, taking a short-term smaller reward rather than waiting for a bigger reward later. And as the name suggests, the combined type can be a mix of both sets of symptoms. Added to this is the fact that, like autistic people, ADHD people can also experience hyperfocus. So what is happening in the brain of someone with ADHD to cause these differences? When a person experiences pleasure, there is a release of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain, which reinforces the association between the activity the person was doing and the pleasure. This encourages them to repeat the activity in future. Dopamine is involved in several key functions, including mood, working memory, attention, and decision-making. People with ADHD may have a higher number of dopamine transporters in the brain. The role of these transporters is to move dopamine into and out of neurons to regulate dopamine levels. These extra dopamine transporters can cause the removal of dopamine too quickly, which means the dopamine has less time to exert its effects. This can lead to the brain seeking to replace that lost dopamine by promoting activities it knows will produce more. This imbalance of dopamine can also contribute to difficulties in concentrating and impulsivity. In short, people with ADHD often feel understimulated or bored, leading them to seek out activities or experiences that will produce a quick dopamine boost. The prevalence of ADHD in adults is currently considered to be between 6 and 10% of the population. Similar to autism, the rates of ADHD diagnoses have increased as awareness grows. So like autism, the actual rates of adults with ADHD have not grown per capita. It is only the rates of people who are diagnosed that have grown. The figure that might be more interesting to autistic people, though, is the crossover between autism and ADHD. We find that approximately between 50 and 70% of autistic people also experience ADHD. This figure is quite high, and in some countries, to have a diagnosis of autism automatically triggers a diagnosis of ADHD, triggering access to ADHD medication. So at this point, we have a new word to describe someone who has both autism and ADHD, and that is AuDHD. ADHD and autism are both neurodivergences. So how do they differ? While autism is often described by social and communication challenges, along with rigid thinking patterns and sensory sensitivities, ADHD is described by challenges with attention, focus, hyperactivity, and impulsiveness. It may even appear that autism and ADHD should cancel each other out since they seem to present as opposites. But this is not the case. In fact, this way of thinking was so prevalent prior to 2013, it was not possible to have a dual diagnosis before that time. We now know that autism and ADHD are not opposites, and in fact the combined traits can make life significantly more challenging in any situation. As well as this, the ADHD and autism traits may compete with each other for dominance, meaning our responses to situations may be different depending on whether ADHD or autism is more dominant in that moment. And this will most likely be inconsistent. Now, I could go into further detail here, but there is a lot we can explore in how ADHD and autism interact with each other. So let's talk about that in more detail in the next podcast. All right, we've talked about ADHD from a general perspective, but as I mentioned at the top, I have just been diagnosed with ADHD. So what are some of the specific ways it affects me? The list of traits I gave to my psychologist during my diagnosis came to 22 pages, so let's just pick out a few highlights. Maybe for more detail, I will make another podcast down the track. But for now, how does my ADHD show up? I make careless mistakes because I might rush into a task without properly planning. This is partly because if I don't start quickly, I know I may never start due to inertia. This can extend to rushing to finish a task because my brain wants to move on to something new. Uncontrolled mess and clutter is also another problem for me. Maybe this is my brain not wanting to take the time to put something away properly, so it just gets dumped. My studio space has just become a dumping ground and my desk is atrocious. Another issue I face is losing important items. An example here is about a year ago I had a specific tool in my hand while working on a project outside. I put the tool down on the studio doorstep and then went to pick it back up again only seconds later, but it had vanished. Now I know it must have been me that moved it as no one else was around, but in those few seconds I did something with that tool I have no memory of, and I have not seen that tool again in the year since. There are no gaps the tool could have fallen into or any other hiding places within the area that I could have got to in the amount of time, but I did something. Another aspect is getting distracted by unrelated thoughts. For example, the other day I started to fill the sink to do the dishes, but remembered that I should have called someone, so I went to make a reminder to do that. All the while the sink started to overflow as I just walked away from that task. This can also look like walking into a room to do something, but having no idea why you walked into the room when you arrive. Or picking up the phone to look up something, but seeing a new message that then takes the focus, and then the initial task is forgotten. Feeling restless for me can also be common. That might look like having the overwhelming feeling I should be doing something, but without a clue as to what that something is. On the hyperactivity side of things, I run everywhere, from the car to the shops, from the house to the garage, and so forth. But this is not because I like running, it's just something that happens. And when I'm at the shops, I find waiting in queues so difficult. Sometimes I might put the item I went to buy back on the shelf and walk out if the checkout queue is long. Sitting still is another one that is difficult for me. When I go to the beach, I might sit for a short while, but then I have to go for a long walk up the beach one way. Then when I return, I might sit again for a brief moment. Then I'm up again, walking in the other direction. Time management can also be challenging. Trish calls it Lawson time when Dad and I work on a project together, and what I say will take an hour might take the whole day, forgetting to eat or drink in the process. On the other side of these time management challenges is waiting mode. This is where I might have an appointment later in the day and can't get anything else done prior to that appointment. Because of all of these challenges, I often find myself overcompensating by creating strict routines, that's the autistic side of me, in an attempt to beat the ADHD challenges. A very simple example of this is when I leave the house, I have a rigid checking process I go through to make sure I've turned off PowerPoints, locked the doors, and have not forgotten keys, wallet, phone, etc. Now these routines can look a lot like OCD, and OCD can have a strong relationship to ADHD. But I think in my case, it is my brain's way of overcoming the inattentive side of my ADHD. Often I decide to do something and my body will start in motion towards the place where that thing I need to do is. The problem is that as soon as I'm in motion, my brain says, okay, that task is initiated, so on to the next thing. So when I get to where I was going, or even to the next corner on the path, I now have no memory as to what I was going to do. In this case, I have to visually scan the room to see if I can spot the reason I was there. An extension of this is where I might have two competing tasks. So the brain sends me towards the first location, but before I get there, I am diverted by thoughts of the second task, as in my brain the first task has already been engaged, so it moves on. The problem is that before I get to the second task, the first task comes back into focus. So back in that direction I go. This closed loop can bounce me back and forth a few times before I have to mentally stop and reset. Finally here, a key trait for me has been a real problem in making decisions. This has led to being labelled indecisive by other people, which is stigmatising. And this in turn can lead to being sensitive to feelings of rejection. This is an example of rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or RSD, and is common in both ADHD and autism. And to be clear, for many people with ADHD, this decision anxiety can be crippling. Okay, so everybody experiences many of these traits above. They're just a part of life, aren't they? So is everybody just a little bit ADHD? While all of the traits mentioned earlier might be common, it's the consistency and intensity of those traits that define ADHD. For someone to be considered as having ADHD, the traits or symptoms need to cause significant disruption to daily life. So being a bit messy or forgetting the odd appointment is just human nature. But in ADHD, those things, along with all of the other symptoms, are so prevalent that daily life becomes significantly more challenging. Yes, that is significantly, not just a little bit more challenging. So to state the bleeding obvious, no, you can't be a bit ADHD. You are either ADHD or you are not. Okay, so should you consider getting a diagnosis of ADHD if you are autistic? Well, obviously that is a personal decision, and as we have spoken about in previous podcasts, getting a diagnosis can be expensive and time-consuming. Additionally, finding the right diagnosing specialist who understands ADHD in autistic adults, and even older adults, if that is you, can be challenging. Another consideration is what benefit a diagnosis will add to your personal situation. For me, I am definitely autism dominant, so getting that autistic diagnosis was absolutely key to my self-understanding and journey. When it came time to consider my ADHD, I was still keen to sort out that aspect of my life, so a diagnosis was still important, but nowhere near as important to me as getting my autism diagnosis. So to that end, my psychologist still did a full assessment for ADHD, but by mutual agreement, she did not do a comprehensive written report as a way of keeping some of the costs down. And this was a great compromise in my circumstances. Now, you might find you feel more ADHD dominant, so getting that full diagnosis might be more important to you. Likewise, you may, after doing the research about ADHD and relating that to your own life experience, decide that self-identification is enough for you. That is completely fine. This process is about you and not about other people, so whatever meets your needs is fine. Self-identification is valid. There is, of course, one caveat at this point, and that is to do with treatment. To access ADHD medication, you will, of course, need a formal diagnosis from a medical specialist. Depending on where you live, that would either be a psychiatrist or a doctor. But I would assume would have to be someone who has at least got a medical degree. In my case, I received a diagnosis from a psychologist, which means that at this point I cannot access medication. So if I think I might benefit from medication in the future, I would probably have to get diagnosed from a psychiatrist as well. Now, I went into my diagnosis with the full knowledge that it would not qualify me immediately for medication. But that was a decision I made, understanding the implications of my chosen diagnostic pathway. For those who decide to seek treatment by way of medications, there are a number of drugs that can help alleviate the symptoms of ADHD. But as this is not a path that I've pursued, I think it is better to leave that information to others who have more direct experience there. So is ADHD classified as a disability? The answer to this question may depend on where you live. In Australia, ADHD can be described as a disability depending on functional impact. In other words, it is not automatically classified as a disability, but if ADHD significantly impairs a person's daily life, it can be classified as a disability. The significance of this is in relation to available supports. The system in Australia that supports individuals with disability is the NDIS. So eligibility for NDIS support for ADHD is dependent on functional capacity. Okay, so the next question is, what if I am autistic but don't have ADHD? As mentioned earlier, it is probably more common for autistic people to also have ADHD, but there are still many individuals who just have autism without ADHD. I've heard the term autism pure used to describe autistic people without ADHD. The reality for these individuals is that they still have significant daily challenges due to their autism alone, so they are in no way less impacted by not having a dual diagnosis. Their challenges will just be unique to them in certain ways. This is where the word spectrum finds its use, in that every autistic or ADHD or AuDHD person will have a different set of experiences unique to them individually. One key area of ADHD is to do with executive dysfunction. Executive functioning is how we manage day-to-day tasks like time management, working memory, organisation, multitasking, planning and prioritising, attention, regulating emotions, and self-monitoring. In ADHD, any of these core aspects may be affected, which can then lead to some of the traits we have already talked about, such as distraction, focus, motivation, and impulse control. It's also important to note that while executive dysfunction is a core trait of ADHD, it is not solely associated with ADHD and may be present in other conditions such as autism, depression, stroke, MS, concussion, or brain injuries. Now, as we have talked about, people with ADHD are often subconsciously dopamine seeking, as they may have a natural deficit in this area. So what are some of the common ways we can help ourselves in managing this dopamine seeking need? Regular exercise can boost dopamine. Even short bursts of activity may help when motivation is needed for a specific task. Creative activities like art and music may also be helpful. For some people, mindfulness or medication may help, but this may also be problematic for autistic people. Breaking tasks into smaller steps, creating small achievable goals may also help, along with exploring new hobbies or skills. Okay, so summing up, we have had a look at what ADHD is, some common symptoms or traits of people with ADHD, what is happening in the brains of people with ADHD, whether to consider a diagnosis, and ADHD as a disability. Next time, I will go a bit deeper into how ADHD and autism interact and how that may look in day-to-day life of someone with both. So if that might be of interest, please like and subscribe and look out for the next episode. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye for now.